Hey everybody, welcome to the Psychology of Games podcast, where we discuss how psychology and video games interact to shape our behavior, our beliefs, and our purchasing intentions. My name is Jamie Madigan, a psychology PhD and a lifelong gamer. I write and podcast about this stuff on psychologyofgames.com, and I'll be your host. This is the episode about how psychology can create more convincing artificial intelligence in games. Okay, by law, I have a few seconds now to tell you about my Patreon campaign. Patreon.com is a system that allows people like you to support this podcast and the website by donating as little as $1 or $2 a month. This helps me pay for stuff I need to do the podcast and write the articles and keep all that going. Plus, you get some Patreon-only benefits like early access to podcasts and access to audio versions of articles. So go to patreon.com/POG, that's for Psychology of Games, to get more information. Okay, we're done. Alan Turing was one of the most awesome nerds of his day. Among other things, he was a mathematical genius known for working to decrypt German ciphers during World War II, saving countless lives and probably curtailing the war by several years. He's also widely considered to be the father of computer science in general and the field of artificial intelligence in specific. This even though the latter only really existed for him in theory and as thought experiments. One such experiment dealt with what it means to say that a computer can think and possess enough intelligence to resemble a human being. It's known as the Turing test. The test is a variation of a party game called the imitation game. In that game, one player is isolated from two other people, a man and a woman. The player's job is to interrogate them both and use their written answers to his questions to figure out which was the man and which was the woman. But here's the trick. One of the pair would always try to trick the interrogator, and the other would always try to help him. So one would, for example, answer the question, "Are you a woman?" truthfully, while the other would answer with a lie. Turing's variation on the game proposed that one of the question answerers was a computer that was trying to pass for a human. Remember that all the answers to the interrogator's questions were submitted in writing. The interrogator's job would then be to determine who was the computer and who was human. Doing this would be difficult to the extent that the computer was clever. Turing illustrated this by suggesting these possible questions that could be asked of a computer trying to pass for a meat bag. Question: please write me a sonnet on the subject of the Fourth Bridge. Answer:
count me out on this one. I never could write poetry.
Question: add 34,957 to 70,764.
105,621.
Question: do you play chess?
Yes.
Question: I have K at my K1 and no other pieces. You have K at K6 and R at R1. It's your move. What do you play?
R2 or 8. Mate?
If the computer could fool the interrogator most of the time in this little game, then it would pass the test and would be able to pass as human if not said to be thinking or intelligent. Now, most modern AI researchers now agree that the Turing test isn't a perfect marker for artificial intelligence or even the only meaningful conceptualization of AI. But the thought experiment and goal of making a computer program sophisticated enough to pass for another human is important to gamers like you and me. We interact with computer-controlled AIs all the time in games. Be they enemy bots in a first-person shooter, a shopkeeper or a quest giver in an RPG, or an opposing army in an RTS game, or even a defensive tackle in a football game. Making these opponents and fellow citizens of the gaming world do their jobs with perfect precision is straightforward for programmers who know what they're doing. They can make an opponent headshot the player every time. They can make the enemy base in an RTS thrum with perfect efficiency as it executes an optimized build order. They can make interacting with a medieval barkeep seem less like talking to a person and more like using a vending machine. But that's not always the best way to build AI. It's not always what draws the player in and gets her interested and immersed in the game. Sometimes you want your potentially perfect AI to be a little less perfect and a little more human. Take, for example, Watson, a computer system created by IBM that competed on the game show Jeopardy against the best humans in the history of the show. The AI's performance had a few quirks. It repeated a wrong answer given by another player because it wasn't equipped to pay attention to them, and it provided "What is Toronto?" to an item in the category called U.S. cities. Regardless, Watson still absolutely demolished his fleshy competition thanks to its superior programming. This was all fun and games as an exhibition, but I don't think anybody would be interested in viewing this kind of lopsided competition for long, any more than we'd be likely to play Call of Duty against bots that line up headshots in a few microseconds. To get along with humans, Watson needed to be tweaked. So one of the applications to which Watson was put after the Jeopardy tournament was medical diagnosis. Its ability to sift through massive amounts of medical information and apply sophisticated regression formulas and probability models made it great at the task. Yet, when asked to do this with a real healthcare setting with real doctors, the doctors resisted accepting the proclamations because they didn't think a computer had the human touch and didn't want their own expert judgment supplanted by that of an AI. To get around this obstacle, IBM programmers employed a simple trick that Turing might have been impressed with. They simply made Doc Watson couch his diagnoses with a little humility. Instead of saying, "The polyp is benign, meatbag," Watson would instead say something along the lines of, "I've got some thoughts on this case, and I think you may like to hear them. They're listed below, ranked by how confident I am in them." Doctors loved this change because it felt more like they were interacting and conversing with a person. My guest on the podcast today is an expert on developing artificial intelligence for video games. He's learned how to develop more convincing AI by studying the flaws and quirks of human psychology and accommodating them or even building them into computer-controlled opponents. So let's get on with the interview. All right, so thanks for joining us for this part of the podcast. As I mentioned, my guest this episode is Dave Mark, the man with two first names who works at Intrinsic Algorithm, applying psychology and a lot of other tricks to designing artificial intelligence in games and that sort of thing. So, Dave, thanks for joining. And why don't you just kind of kick us off by telling us a little bit about yourself. Who are you and what are you doing here?
Who am I? Well, as mentioned, thank you. I am Dave Mark. I'm the president and lead designer of Intrinsic Algorithm in Omaha, Nebraska. Started out as an independent game studio, an idea that my wife and I had about, 13 years ago. But more recently, I have been doing AI consulting over the past 5 or 6 years for the game business, as well as even some stuff outside the game business. Author of the book Behavioral Mathematics for Game AI that was published about 6 years ago now. I am the co-founder, along with Steve Rabin, of the AI Game Programmers Guild, which is a collection of coming up on 500 professional AI programmers around the world.
Wow.
And then with Steve, I also am the co-advisor for the AI Summit at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco every year.
Okay, so it sounds like you got a lot going on.
Yeah, usually, yes.
Tell me about some of the consulting work that you do around AI and games. Like what might somebody hire you to do, and sort of how do you apply the world of psychology to that?
Well, as far as the consulting goes, the roles that I play is for various studios around the country and really around the world is that I come in and I could help them either with the technical aspects of, well, this is how you actually program AI. But a lot of times I come in from a design side. This is how you might apply some of the standard tools that all of us use for programming AI in more creative, more believable ways to improve the gameplay experience of the players, which is, after all, ostensibly what we all want to do in the game business. Mm-hmm. So I have worked, for example, for the past year with ArenaNet, an expansion for Guild Wars 2, which is their banner title that they have out on MMO.
Yeah, I play that.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. And they have been ripping out and redoing their entire AI architecture based on my architecture, with then a lot of extra stuff, hooked into their system. To improve, again, the gameplay experience, they had identified they wanted to have better AI in their games. Not just individual combat AI, but bigger picture stuff as well, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. But prior to that, I was working with the Storybricks team and Sony Online with the AI architecture that was going to be going into the still in development EverQuest Next. So very similar situation is taking my architecture and applying it to help them be able to support very designer, customizable, configurable, emergent AI. And what I mean by that is AI that isn't just running on rails on script. Okay, and then when the player walks around this corner, you run from this point over to that point. No, having AI that actually kind of thinks for itself.
Yeah, I think we're all familiar with that early days of like first-person shooters where you walk into a room and everybody just sort of starts following a script and running, and directions would be the same every time. So Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
I get what you mean. So how do you go about creating something that you described it as convincing? So I imagine it's pretty easy to design AI that would be, perfect every time, and it would just annihilate the player on sight or follow a really sort of conventional script. Like, how do you go about making that more emergent and more convincing?
Well, a lot of it is making the agent, the AI character, if you will, aware of its environment, above and beyond just something like the player walked around a corner, stepped over an imaginary tripwire, and so therefore it is supposed to do A, then B, then C, and sometimes not even B and C, sometimes just A.
Shoot.
Yeah, exactly. Making the AI aware of its world, its surroundings, contextual information. Am I alone, or do I have some buddies around me? Am I wounded? Am I pinned down in a corner that I can't get out of? More than just going from A to B, point the gun at the player and fire. But one of the things you touched on is very interesting. You talked about making the AI perfect is actually easier. I mean, any script kiddie, as we call them sometimes, hacks a first-person shooter and makes a headshot bot. Well, that's pretty easy to do. Where's the head? Align the character to the head and shoot. That doesn't happen in the real world. A lot of making AI believable is making it imperfect. And oddly enough, that is a lot of where the challenge is. But that's also where the believability is it was trying to do this and it got close, but it didn't quite shoot me. It got close to me. It sometimes it hits me, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it makes the absolute optimal decision, and sometimes it makes a decision that isn't optimal. And I think that there's a sweet spot in there between perfectly random, which at times could be completely ridiculous.
Yeah, nonsensical, yeah.
Exactly. And on the other end of the spectrum, you could have perfectly rational, perfect thinking, perfect execution. Well, someplace in there, depending on what type of behavior we're talking about, is a zone of not perfectly rational, but reasonable. That may not be the best thing to do, but I can see why he did that. And as an example, if you were to put 100 people in a room and you give them exactly the same stimuli of here's all the situation and then this happens, what is it that you do? How do you as a person react? You're going to get a lot of different reactions. Some of them are going to be the same. Some of them are going to be better than others. But most of them, if not all of them, I'd like to think all of them, would be reasonable, that you would look at that person in isolation and say, I can see why he did that. That makes sense. A lot of times the way we do AI is here is the one way that you are going to respond to this set of stimuli. Trying to model that area between absolutely mathematically perfectly rational, optimal, and I'm just going to roll random dice and see what happens is where a lot of the not only the difficulty in programming good AI comes from, but again, a lot of the thing that gives character to our characters, if you'll pardon the expression. Mm-hmm. And so that's the believability. That's where we get immersion. That's where we start to think about these characters as real, in quotes, if you would, please. They feel like, well, that's kind of how other players would play in those situations.
Right. So is the end goal to create something that seems like another person or that is indistinguishable from another person? That would kind of pass the Turing test of, you're not sure if you're playing against bots or humans or some mix, or is it something that just sort of, we know we're playing against, a computer opponent, but let's at least make it interesting and more realistic.
Well, and actually there's two axes, if you would, on this. One of it is you want to make it immersive and believable so it doesn't just look sterile and robotic. And that's kind of what I've been talking about here. Mm-hmm. But the other thing, too, is that from a game design standpoint, you also have to respect what it is that you're trying to have the player accomplish. What is the player trying to succeed at? And back in 2008 at the Game Developers Conference, Soren Johnson, who was the lead designer on Civ 4, as well as the AI programmer, had a great line in a lecture of his where he said the job of the AI is to just barely lose, so that the player has a fight, but they come out either winning, or if they do lose, they at least know why, and they can come back after it again and improve themselves and everything. And so to give that continual challenge, but then just barely lose and yield, because to be honest, we're trying to make the player feel like a badass.
Yep.
And so if you're constantly getting crushed, well, then you don't feel like a badass. You feel like you're constantly getting crushed. But on the other hand, if it's too easy and you're just mowing down everything in sight, well, yeah, for a little while that might make you feel good as a player, but eventually you're going to go, all I have to do is spin in a circle and shoot, and I'm killing things because they're too dumb to get out of the way. Well, that's also not a compelling experience. And so now we have these two sometimes competing interests of how do we make an AI that feels realistic, looks realistic, but occasionally is just dumb enough so that the player can beat it.
What are some lessons from psychology you can draw on to program and build into those AIs to do that?
Interestingly, a lot of stuff coming from the world of film has given us a lot of ideas in how people process watching film or watching something in the outside world. And I'll touch on a couple of those in a second. The other thing, too, is that the areas of psychology independent of film that have really helped us realize how people just process information, how they process themselves, self-reflection, et cetera, give us some hints. Now, in the nexus of those two areas, there's a lot of interesting things that you can learn. First of all, for example, about 100 years ago, there was, in days of early film, there was an experiment that was done by a filmmaker, and it's now called the Kuleshov effect. The Kuleshov effect is where they had an actor who looked at the camera, was very straight-faced, no expression whatsoever. And they took film clips of him. You could just barely see him moving and stuff like that. Took film clips of him and interspersed it with, for example, a clip of a steaming bowl of soup, or a child laying in a coffin, or a woman looking kind of sultry and sensuous laying on a couch. Mm-hmm. And they would show people the clip of the soup or the child or the woman or whatever, and the actor, and ask, what is he thinking or feeling or whatever? And they would say, oh, well, he's feeling hunger for the soup. You can tell by looking at his face. Oh, he's feeling sorrow for the dead child. Oh, he's feeling desire and lust for the woman. The thing was, it was the exact same clip that was shown to everybody.
They showed it to three different groups. Like one person saw the man in the soup, another group saw a man in the woman, another group saw a man in the corpse.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And yet they all came up with these different things because the actor was so straight-faced and plain and sterile. Despite trying to find out, looking at his face, what he was thinking or feeling, because they couldn't find any information, they had to project what they thought he should have been feeling. Now, apply that to video games, of where, obviously lately we do really, really good stuff with facial animation, body animation, everything, but we're not perfect. But a lot of times, by just juxtaposing a game character with something else, whether it be another character, whether it be some environment, art, etc., we can get the player, with the psychology that they're sitting down with, that's built into them, to feel, oh, this character that I'm interacting with on the screen, whether it be friend or foe, is obviously feeling this, he means this, because of just, if you'll call it, the environmental storytelling of how should he be feeling given these situations. So now you combine the Kuleshov effect, put that aside for a moment, and then you go fast forward to 1945, where Fritz Heider and Marianne Simmel were a couple of psychologists who did a very kind of seminal paper on what's the name of the paper? It's
I know the one you mean.
I actually have it here. An experimental study of apparent behavior, which is a fantastic, academic sounding title.
So that's apparent behavior, not behavior by a parent, like a father or a mother.
Sorry,
okay.
Behavior that you think you see that is there.
Got it.
It could very well be in your parents. Who knows? But what they did is they created a film that was all stop action stuff that had 2 triangles, a circle, and a bunch of lines. And the film is about a minute and a half long. And what they did is they sat people down and said, watch this. No other instructions. Watch this. And then afterwards, okay, tell me what you saw. Notice they didn't say, tell me what happened. Tell me about these shapes. They said, what did you see? In this film? And people will come up with these stories. And you can actually find this on YouTube. Just search for Hyder and Simmel and watch it yourself, because it's really interesting. But they came up with this entire narrative around, well, obviously the triangle's this and the circle that, and this is what the lines were, and then this happened, and then this happened. And they come up, and a lot of people came up with a very, very similar narrative. So what they actually saw was 2 triangles, a circle, and some lines.
And they kind of move around, but almost randomly. Yeah.
It seems like that. But now, obviously, it was constructed that, okay, we're going to do the type of movement so that people could extract a narrative around that. Now, why is this important to psychology in games? Well, people wanted they needed there to be some sort of plot, a narrative, what is actually happening, even though these are the most minimalistic anthropomorphic objects you can have, 2 triangles and a circle specifically. But by interpreting things like how fast were the shapes moving, how are they moving in proximity to each other, and then of course the context of a slow movement at this time might feel different than a slow movement at another time, which is that at that point is very similar to the Kuleshov effect. You're taking the context around the movement into the situation. So for games, though, it's like, okay, well, what if with very minimal things? I mean, but we all put narratives on very, very sparse graphics back in the late 70s, early 80s, and even into the 90s. And then today with a lot of indie games, you have things like Thomas Was Alone, where it's rectangles and they have personalities.
I was actually going to mention, I wrote a blog article about the Heimer Simmel experiment and talked about Thomas and Alone in specific, because that's a game where you literally play as a bunch of little rectangles, and there's not much.
Yeah, we feel a connection to, the tall one is this and the red one is that. And
we want to sort of fill in the blanks. And even in games like Dark Souls, where you may just encounter this creature, this group of creatures, or this boss, we're very susceptible to suggestions about how to fill in those blanks, because we do want some sort of narrative structure. We're hardwired for it. It's an adaptive, evolutionary process that's helped us evolve societies.
And mostly nowadays, all we do is we use it to try to interpret what the 2 cats in our living room are doing at one time. He's obviously thinking this. No, he's just sitting there going, God, I wish I had not eaten so much. So, but we have to put narratives on these things. And that's a very, very powerful thing for games, is that we can provide a framework for, okay, we may only show this character and that character, and everybody else is kind of moving around randomly in the background. But damn it, if we don't sit there and go, oh, you see that guy in the background of this GTA thing, he's going to the ATM because he's paying for, he needs to pay off his drug deal. No, he's not. It was just a character randomly saying, hey, I'm going to go over to and interact with that object in the game. But we come up with believable narratives around what's going on. So the more of that we can put in, the richer our game worlds can be, just by leveraging the psychology that the players already have in their brains.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Watch Dogs actually leaned on that, but then took it half a step further, where you could put your little cursor or your hacking device over people. You could listen to their conversations, or you could get information about them that would sort of describe or suggest reasons for what they were doing. So I hadn't actually thought of that angle before either.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of things, as long as we, and again, that was the extra step further. That's something that does take a little bit of designer intervention, some authorial things. Now you can mix and match randomly for that matter. Well, the reason he's going to the ATM is not because he's going to do a drug deal, but because he's got to buy a toy for his kid on the way home. You can put random stuff in there, and the player would go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense, right?"
But then we build on that, and we sort of add and imagine our own additional information, like, oh, maybe his kid is sick. It's got the chicken pox, and he's a single dad, and he's about to lose the caregiver, for his kid or whatever.
And that's the thing is it's all about when our players sit down, they are not blank slates. They have their own psychology, their own associations that they may make. And that's why, like when watching the Hyder Simmel film, a lot of people came up with very similar narratives. And again, I'm specifically avoiding coming up with any of them so that if people want to watch it themselves, they can, get their own thing. But I've had a couple people that came up with some quite legitimately. I don't think they were screwing with me. That you go, dude, wow, there's a therapy bill in your future. Where did that come from?
Let's hope they get therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so players sit down with their own psychology, their own associations that they make, and by just providing them with hooks, they can, start filling in all the blanks themselves. They're a very color by number thing, but not color by number, because that's telling you what to put in what. Just a coloring book. Hey, color it your own, whatever it is you want.
Yeah, the other thing that the Kuleshov effect makes me think of is the affect heuristic, where, the quick moving part of our brain will substitute an easy question in place of a more difficult question. So if, looking at a person and you're trying to figure out what does that person feel or what is he thinking, like that's a difficult question if you don't have the benefit of peering into his brain. But your own brain will sort of substitute an easier question of, well, how do I feel? After seeing that dead child or that bowl of soup or that sexy lady, and often without realizing it, will substitute that easier question and then use the answer to that question for the more difficult question. Say, oh, well, obviously, yeah, he's hungry. I think I just saw him, salivate a little bit or lick his lips a little bit.
Oh yeah, if when you watch the Kuleshov effect stuff, if you are paying attention to yourself, and I've watched it dozens, scores of times because I use it in a lot of my lectures, is you will find yourself automatically searching the corners of the mouth, the corners of the eyes, the point between on the forehead, just above the nose. Because those are places where a lot of times emotion is represented. Oh, I swear I just saw that the corners of his mouth tighten a little bit. Well, yeah, you could see that on all three of those examples and come up with a completely different interpretation. Oh, wait, the corners of his mouth is because he just swallowed because he was looking at the soup. Or, ooh, wow, he's feeling grief and remorse for about the child, so the corners of his mouth tighten. But if you pay attention to where you look, you almost can't stop yourself because you are going to be scanning those faces. And faces and eyes are ridiculously important to us to get all that contextual information out of. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I did for a client of mine as we were working on some stuff, a consulting client, and I ended up putting it in my lectures, and he's now a bit famous.
Yes. Tell me about Egg Boy.
Yes, Egg Boy. That I did not come up with that name. My client did. I have to blame him. But it's actually very aptly named because all Egg Boy is basically an egg-shaped head with two horizontally oriented egg-shaped eyes. And it sounds boring, right? It's just a big round head and two eyes. The thing is, though, I have it set up so that it will move pretty randomly, but it's parameterized randoms where I'll say, move this often at this speed, this much of a pause between movements. And occasionally I will have it do eye contact, if you will, where it'll look directly at the camera for a period of time. I can also change the frequency of the eye contact, the duration, stuff like that. Well, the thing is, by setting up different parameter sets, what I was able to do is by pressing a key on the keyboard, it would change and Egg Boy would go to a different parameter set, and people detected what they thought would be feelings out of Egg Boy. Now, of course, he's a couple of eggs. He doesn't have feelings. But
right, so let me just make sure I understand what we're talking about. It would just literally be like an oval, a white oval with a pair of eyes that's supposed to be like a face.
Correct.
Or just a face shape with some eyes on it.
That's correct. Yeah, it was just nice, smooth eggs. It's why we called it Egg Boy. It looked like an egg.
Got it. Okay.
And so, if by uh, I've done this with a number of different groups where I will press a key and the parameter set will change. And so Egg Boy starts, perhaps his head inclines back a little bit and his eyes are looking, down at you. And, well, what is Egg Boy feeling? And people would say, oh, well, he's suspicious or nervous, because his head was moving a little bit more rapidly. And then I press another key after maybe 30 seconds or so, and the parameters would change. And now he's kind of looking down, looking off to the side a little bit. Occasionally, just for a briefest second, his eyes would flick up at you, at making that eye contact. Oh, well, he's shy or sad. And people would call out almost instantly, this is what Egg Boy's feeling. All because of the position of the head, the position of the eyes, the random movement, how fast they were moving, how often they were looking at you. And I had 5 or 6 different emotions, if you will. Oh, it was just different parameter sets. Now, of course, I was intentionally creating the parameters to say, how would someone who is angry or suspicious or shy or sad look? Mm-hmm. But other than that, it was completely random. But we got all of that information. People felt an empathy with Egg Boy just through a head and 2 eyes. Now imagine if I were to add eyebrows or a mouth or shoulders to that. Now the interesting thing too is after you watch Egg Boy for a couple of minutes, one of the keys returns it so that it is actually perfectly still, looking straight ahead, right at the camera. And people actually have commented that it feels like Egg Boy died. Now the irony being, that's how a lot of not as much anymore, but how a lot of conversation interaction with game characters in RPGs tends to look, as they stare straight at you on the camera and they don't move. And it gets unnerving after a little while because that's not how we have conversations. People, for example, only make eye contact in a conversation about 20% of the time.
Yeah, you know what? I'm playing Batman Arkham Knight right now, and what you're describing is exactly how Batman looks in a lot of the kind of cutscenes where he'll just have this dead eye, 100-yard stare. He's just like looking past whoever he's talking to.
Admittedly, that's Batman, though.
Yeah, true. I mean, he's psychotic, so maybe that fits. He's as crazy as they come, but it is really distracting. It's kind of like, no, that doesn't look right, or it looks like some of the animation broke, like somebody forgot to load a file or something, and it just doesn't look human, doesn't look right.
I remember noticing this in Skyrim. In fact, I blogged about it and put a couple of videos up. Is Skyrim at least did not do what we call docking, is where when you engage with somebody, or what it's the term is usually used when somebody engages with an object in the world. So they'll go to a specific point, rotate toward the object, and interact with it. Well, they do that in conversations too, is where they would come and face you directly. Well, if you engaged in conversation with somebody in Skyrim, as long as they were facing generally toward you, they wouldn't necessarily rotate to face you. They'd just turn their head. But that was the extent of it. And so after a little while, you're like, you're still standing at a 45-degree angle to me. And so when people talk, make them rotate a little bit, make them pace, you move a foot back and forth, rotate the upper body. But certainly, as we talked about with Egg Boy, look away, look down, look up, glance around at other points of interest. If somebody walks by the conversation, you need to glance at them and then glance back at the person they're talking to. This is what makes people feel alive, because again, that's what we do. And as I proved with Egg Boy, it wasn't very complicated. Again, it was the same engine saying, I'm going to do random stuff based on the parameters you give me. Mm-hmm. And you could extend those parameters to include how often you're going to shuffle your feet, how often you're going to change your body orientation, your upper body orientation, fidget animations like, I'm going to, put my hand through my hair. I'm going to scratch my hip, stuff like that. But you could do it all with random numbers and just say, hey, fill in the blank. And it's going to make your players feel more comfortable because it feels like you're talking to a real person.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other games I've been playing lately is The Witcher 3, and it does that really well. It always seems like the NPCs that you talk to in that are behaving naturally, and they're mm-hmm. never just standing there at a slightly off axis and speaking into air. It always seems like they're talking to Geralt.
And the irony of that is that you think, okay, more things happening could mean more distraction for the player. When it's actually the opposite is when nothing is happening and it feels unnatural, that's actually the distraction, the immersion breaker is, oh my God, why is he not moving? This is bothering me. Whereas if you have lots of normal movement, stuff just kind of blends in because it's the way it's supposed to be. And as people, we just don't notice that that's even happening.
Okay. So in terms of, how do you use some psychological lessons to create more convincing NPCs? You talked about, using contextual information to fill in blanks, and you talked about using nonverbal behaviors and eyes and animations to sort of, I guess, sometimes do the same or directly communicate what you're talking about. Any other, types of tips or information or things that you found work really well?
A lot of it, as we kind of touched on with Egg Boy and some of the others, is just randomizing things, fuzzying things up a little bit. Again, not to the point where we're completely random, but we're in that reasonable zone that we talked about, and that's what puts it in the realm of where people are. Some of the things that I've talked about to prove this point about being non-rational. For example, a very simple thing that psychologists have used and studied for a while, called the ultimatum game. Mm-hmm. The ultimatum game is really simple. Is if I, as I'm running this, I go up to two people. I say, all right, I'm going to give you, person A, $100. However, here's the caveat: is you need to offer a portion of that to person B, who's standing right here, so he's aware that this is the deal. And if person B accepts your offer, then that's fine. I don't care. Off you guys go. You keep what you kept. He keeps what you offered him. Great. If he rejects you, however, I'm going to take the $100 back. How much do you offer if you are person A? Well, obviously, the mathematical optimal thing is if both players were absolutely perfectly rational, would be $1. Person B is not going to turn it down because they're going to say, hey, I got $1. And if I turn him down, I have zero. So.
Yeah, it's more dollars than I had before. Right.
Exactly. But on the other hand, A gets to keep the most amount of money. He gets to keep the 99. So he's maximizing his situation. Person B is maximizing theirs. But that's not the way people do it. Is in studies, people have tended to give about $30. Obviously a perfectly equitable split would be 50-50. But people tend to give about $30, and that's usually when person B is happy. They're like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. But, it varies. It's a huge range of some people will be expecting more towards that 50. And if you don't offer it to them, they're going to turn you down and say, well, never mind, I don't want 40. If you only offered me 40, you're an asshole. I'm going to turn it down. And so you don't get anything. Ha ha. So there's a spike thing in there. The thing that's even more interesting is that even when people know that they are playing, that person B, if you will, is a computer, and that computer has no feelings, they don't have to worry about, oh, am I insulting him? Is he going to feel spite? Is he going to be, I want to look like a good person? Even when all that's off the table, because player B, if you will, is a computer, people still offer $20, $30, $40. Why? Maybe they're afraid of being judged by the person running the experiment. Maybe they're worried about being judged by themselves. Yeah. Well, I don't want to. This is not the kind of person I am to be stingy and only give $1. It's not that mathematically optimal. And so we have this really weird psychology of how people process other players, even computer players. So, if they were interacting with somebody in the game, if you were to just build a shopkeeper bot or somebody who you were trying to hire to go and do like some sort of hitman job or something in a game, and the mathematical model was if you get something more than you would if you turned it down, will then say yes. Well, then players are instantly going to offer $1. Within 24 hours, the entire internet's going to say, oh, by the way, this is how you get this guy to do your hitman job, or this is how much you need to pay for this magical potion. It's just give him $1 and he'll be fine with it. Well, when you're doing AI, well, how do you model those emotions of things like spite, generosity? If you were doing it the other way, if you were modeling player A, in this as an AI? How do you model all of these different emotions and both positive and negative in order to make it seem like there's a human behind this? The other thing too is, by the way, that amount that people are willing to offer or willing to accept changes based on context. They've done all sorts of things where if you have them listen to different music, or if you give them a shot of oxytocin, which is the
love
hormone. Yeah, exactly. Give them a nasal shot of oxytocin, which I wonder if that's over the counter. I wonder if you can get that.
If so, why are we not doing it right now?
Exactly. Yes, I love you, Jamie. But by changing those types of stimulus, people's offers will go up. If you decrease their serotonin, they will actually be angrier and more frustrated and more likely to turn down offers if they're player B, stuff like that. What if in the game, okay, you've got this vendor, but you are a very scary looking dude. You've got badass armor. You're known to be, killing people around town. Why is it that he always gives you the exact same price for everything? Why doesn't that change? Or if you just did him a favor, maybe he's a little bit more likely. And so now we've taken our mathematical model and said, well, but we have to mess with it, skew it one way or the other based on all these different inputs. And that's a really interesting problem, but it makes the characters feel, now we automatically remember the player's going to put a narrative on this. Oh, well, the reason that he gave me a deal or accepted this offer is because of all of the good things that I've done.
Or the bad things that I've done to his village, or the time that I didn't, take him up on his stupid little side quest that I didn't want to mess with at the time.
Right. So now we've got this over time, this setup of spite. And again, we don't have to explicitly say it. The player is going to fill in the blanks of, maybe I shouldn't be such an asshole all the time. And this guy would, play along a little bit more and accept my offers and stuff like that. So
does it hurt or help to surface that sort of stuff? Like to have a faction gauge or score to say with these people, your score is 513 and that's high, or just to leave it completely all under the hood and not let the players know at any given time, necessarily what the numerical value is for how much that character likes them or dislikes them or is afraid of them or what have you?
Well, there's two schools of thought on that. One is that a lot of times players are a bit dense, and if you don't explain it to them, or you don't show them, especially if there's a time component in between the cause and effect, that they're just not going to get it. They're going to go, why is this doing this? I don't understand. They'll be frustrated and broken. But a lot of times that's because it's far more expensive to put in a lot of those other contextual clues. Like, for example, if we were to change the animations of a shopkeeper, both body, facial, change the audio of the way he says things to you, so that now I've come into his shop and compared to before, he's not paying attention to me as much. He's glaring at me out of the corner of his eyes. Think Egg Boy again. He's a little bit more clipped and terse in his conversations with me. And now when I offer him that $30 just to keep the money straight, he turns me down. Well, wait a minute. He used to be fine with $30 before. Well, if you've added all of this other contextual stuff, the player is going to say, what did I do to piss this guy off? He's actually acting, looking, he makes me feel completely different than he did before. But if you can't put all of that information into your voiceover, your animation, etc., it's a little harder for the player to understand what's going on. So at that point, yes, being able to abstract it out into some sort of numerical thing is going to be helpful. Now, I think as technology progresses and we can get away with the pipelines are better, so we can express these things better, we can probably get away with a lot more. Yes.
Did you ever play a game called Alpha Protocol? Or do you ever remember that? I think it was a BioWare game a few years ago.
I'm familiar with the title, but I did not play it.
It was like a spy game. So you played like a secret agent, and the way that the decisions that you made and the choices you made, it was the only game I've ever seen where they sort of stacked and layered it so much to where different characters would remember what you did and what choices you made and who you decided to save or who you accused or even like what dialogue options you took. And the game could play out in so many different ways, even like sort of rewriting or changing the narrative underneath to where like, oh, that person was like a double agent if you made these choices, but she wasn't if you did this, and this person was your ally. And even like the most crazy stuff was that you, the player, might turn out to be like a double agent working for the enemy at the end of the game if you made the certain choices. Just sort of all the stuff that you just described there made me think of how well that game built in those sort of relationships.
I pulled it up while you were talking, and I believe, kind of embarrassingly, I did write a blog post about it. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look through, but because people were complaining about some of the basic AI, things like pathfinding and whatnot.
It had issues in some ways. Like you could really easily abuse like the stealth system to where you could be invisible, just walking in front of people and go up and then strangle them to death while their, buddy was standing next to him smoking a cigarette. So it had issues, but it was also amazing in some other ways.
Yeah, but that type of multi-layered stuff where you're going from not only the faction level, but down to the individual level. Yeah, my faction isn't a big fan of you, but you helped me personally, so I guess I'll kind of let some of it slide. That's a lot of what I was working on with Stefan Burra as part of the Storybricks team for the prototypes we were doing for EverQuest Next. And that's what the Storybricks technology was meant to involve, is trying to come up with that multi-layered stuff where they remembered you, they remembered what you've done for them, what it meant to them. And it's a very complicated thing to do, but that's where we really need to go to make characters more believable in our games, is to model the personality, mood, emotion of game characters that is pulled from context like that. And if we're going to really sink people into, and the thing too is if you build an architecture that does that, and then can strip that, well, what is my current state of emotion towards you, and then just pick from all of the different things I have, then you don't have to manually script the entire thing. You get around a lot of the content generation problem that we have in games because the characters are just living in the world just like you.
So, Dave, it really sounds to me like what you're talking about is creating procedurally generated guild drama.
There you go. That'll work.
Yeah. All right. Just cut out the middleman. We don't even have to talk to people anymore. I can get pissy about missing that raid appointment without ever having to be in a guild.
Yeah, so there's a lot that can go into that, and it is a very knotty problem. And KNOTTY, not NAUGH, not naughty problem. That's different. But to try to create something that's believable, that isn't going to tip wildly out of control, so that it's kind of self-moderating. But on the other hand, that's also kind of what I do. That's the type of AI that I aspire to. That's what my book was about, is how do we create those believable people so that we can just turn agents loose in the world and let them live and interact not only with you, but with each other in believable ways, etc. So.
Yeah, so let's take a second to plug your book or talk about it. So I think in the title and even parts of the book talk a lot about the behavioral mathematics, and it sounds like a lot of the things we've been discussing so far. But if I were to pick up that book and look at it, what would I find in there, especially around how it overlaps with the worlds of psychology?
Well, the behavioral mathematics for game AI is the full title, as you mentioned, and it actually sounds a bit more complex and dense than it really is, because for the first half of the book, I don't even get into a lot of math or code or anything. I'm talking about what makes people decide the way they do. And there's a lot of game theory, decision theory. How do we process the world? How do we sort out what's important? And I gradually get into how do we then turn those into mathematical models. Now, some of that is work that's been done over the past 50, 60 years. Anyway, game theory, for example, with John von Neumann, and Oscar Morgenstern, with their book, they, said, well, this is how we mathematically model things like Prisoner's Dilemma. That was a game theory staple that many people are familiar with. But that gets into the psychology of, well, how do we make decisions about stuff with all of the information, with some of the information? And I talk about how to model that in the book. One of the things that's really important that comes out of my book and is become quite the buzzword in game AI since that, I didn't invent it, but I kind of started crystallizing it for a lot of people, is the concept of utility theory.
Yeah, that's been around forever, right? It's a staple of economics.
Exactly. It's, economics, they've turned it into psychology, sociology, even biology has started using utility theory. Why do cells do what they do? Well, it's because it's a higher utility to do this. But what utility theory is talking about how to measure things in terms of, how good or bad something is, a decision. Going back to the ultimatum game. Well, what's my utility for the $30? I can turn down the $1. It doesn't matter to me because, you're a jerk and I'm going to be spiteful. On the other hand, if, $5 might mean something to me or it might not. If I'm, a homeless person on the street, I'll take the $5. That's fine.
By the way, you'd have to be really cold to offer a homeless person a $5 split in the ultimatum game. But
yeah, but that's a good, but more psychology and utility theory on that side of the equation then too. So utility theory, though, that the AI architecture that I do is entirely utility based, which is taking, as we've talked about earlier, all of these different contextual clues, what's my situation, and converting them into formulas and numbers and basically scoring every single decision that you could make based on, is it the right thing to do now or not? And some of it is very mechanical, what's the distance, to my target that I want to shoot? Obviously, if I'm closer, it would be better, unless I'm shooting a rocket launcher, in which case it's not a good idea to do it if you're 4 feet away from him. There's very sterile and mechanical things, but then there's also psychology. How do we include morale into a number or a formula? That's not something that isn't inherently a number, but we need to model it as a number because that's the language that computers speak. And so that's what I do in the book, is I go into a lot of that, and also my lectures that I've done at GDC and other places too. Is it talks about utility theory and how we turn characters into believable agents by coming up with these formulas and numbers to convert it into behavior in the game. But yeah, so the book is really about how we think and how we, as people, or as dogs or orcs or dragons, not that I have a lot of experience thinking as an orc, how do we then convert that into a way where you can use it in our games to really suck players in and make them feel like they're doing something against a real person, dog, orc, dragon, whatever.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that sounds cool. So I think we've been going on for almost an hour now, and I think we could probably keep talking for a lot longer, but I want to keep you too much longer.
I can't anyway.
So a couple of questions just to kind of wrap up. Have you been playing anything at all lately? I always like to ask my guests.
Well, unfortunately, the bane of a lot of game programmers is they don't get a chance to play a lot. I've been a little sparse lately. I was playing the Shadows of Mordor.
Oh, that's a good one.
Of Tuca the Assassin. So apparently he only exists in my game, but for me. Yeah. So no, I've been playing that, and of course it's always unfortunate when the people who did the AI, because you can't really slam on it too much. But yeah, there was definitely some really good parts to that AI, more specifically with like the animation selection and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But I really enjoyed that. It did a good job of sucking me in through the Nemesis system.
So good. I hope that Nemesis system is the sort of thing that catches on and we start seeing more games incorporate something like it. I hope it's such a fresh new idea.
The long-term thing of this player or this character remembers me, he's going to change his behaviors accordingly. So the other thing I was playing way too much was I got into City Skylines, because I've been a simulation guy from way back when I was in the 80s. Before many of you were born, and into the not only the simulation stuff, but strategy games and stuff like that. And I saw a quote one time that said City Skylines was the Sim City that we all deserved and never got.
It's pretty true.
And
yeah.
If you the AI is actually spectacular, that you can follow these people around, or the cars they have. This is where they live. This is where they work or go to school. This is where they're going. And it's not that the AI was that complex in what it was doing, but it was the sheer numbers of them. If you had a decent sized city, oh my God, that's a lot of pathfinding calls you're doing. And so just from that standpoint, it was really well done. But also the modeling underneath of everything from economy to pollution and crime, all the SimCity type staples that we're used to tracking. It was very, very well done. And I made the mistake of downloading it from Steam at 11 o'clock at night.
Oh, no.
And so by the time it was 3, I'm like, oh my God, I have to stop. I can't be playing this. So
need more pipes.
There's always one more thing to do.
I've been playing, like I said, Batman Arkham Knight on the PS4. It's really good, especially if you've played any of the previous Batman Arkham games. It looks so good, and the voice acting and the story, the main storyline are done really well. My only kind of complaint with it is that it's a case where less would have been more, in that they have like all of these different side quests where, you got to go rescue the firemen, or you got to go stop this bank robbery, or you got to go track down this bomb, and it's just sort of the same thing over and over again, but they expect you to do it like 15 times at different places on the map. Having like one or two of those things would have been fine. But just doing it like again and again and again and again, it just sort of gets boring. I think, game designers just sometimes feel like we need to fit more. We need to cram more, and we need more side quests and more collectibles. And I'm not even going to do any of the Riddler trophies or any of the collectible stuff. They just forget that. There's like 300 and something.
And you can do procedurally generated quests like the Radiant engine in Skyrim. Yeah. It's like, wait a minute, didn't I clear that fort out and now there's bandits there again? Well, yeah, it's just, they said, okay, we've got a place and we need to staff it with people. And so now next time and then we just need to let somebody in town know about it. And so now, wow, look, hey, this appeared on my map. There's bandits in that same frickin' fort again.
Yeah, but even after like the 8th time you've cleared out bandits from a camp, it just sort of...
Yeah, theoretically you could play 2,000 hours of Skyrim and actually never complete the game, but it would always be new and different because they keep generating more. And so there's a lot of that going on, and I don't know if that's the case with the Batman game, but there's been more of a push towards that because it is always giving you something to do if you don't want to, at least for the moment, pursue the main quest. Or
I have to rescue all the firemen that have been kidnapped around Arkham.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, otherwise it's a great game. So yeah, Arkham Knight, City Skylines, or Shadow of Mordor, any of those games, highly recommended. I've played all of them as well. Before we go, where could people find out more about you on the internet if they were so inclined?
Well, my woefully unupdated website is for the company is intrinsicalgorithm.com, and I'll leave it to you to spell that for your listeners. And then, but the AI Game Programmers Guild website, which is unfortunately also a little behind the schedule, is gameai.com. And I run that, but there's very little about me on there. But if people want to follow me on Twitter, I am IA Dave Mark, not AI Dave Mark, because it's actually for Intrinsic Algorithm Dave Mark. But IA Dave Mark on Twitter is a good place to listen to me musing not only about games and AI, but also my travel misadventures, of which there are plenty, and a lot of poker tweets because I play a lot of poker. Other than that, searching for Dave Mark Game AI will give you all sorts of lectures and posts that I've done on Gama Sutra and at GDC and stuff like that.
Yeah, those GDC presentations you gave, and some of them are available for free in the GDC Vault, and I'll include a link to those as well, because they touch on a lot of the same stuff that we've talked about here today. All right. Well, Dave, thanks very much for your time.
I appreciate it.
It's really interesting stuff, and good luck on any of the future work that you're doing.
Yes, and I really, really want your book. When is your book coming out? I reviewed it, and I still want to have it.
Yeah, you're one of the early reviewers, one of the early readers, and so you've gotten more of it than most people in the world. It'll be out in October.
Excellent. Well, if you liked what I was talking about in this podcast, then buy Jamie's book anyway.
There you go. Ringing endorsement. Awesome.
All right, thanks,
All right,
Jamie.
Dave. Take care. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks again for listening, everybody, and congratulations once again on reaching the end of the podcast. Remember that you can go to psychologyofgames.com to get more information, more articles about psychology and video games, and information on how to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. You can also go there to check out my Patreon campaign and find out how to contact me or follow me on various social networks. So thanks again, and I will see you next time.